Before the ocean burned, before submarines slipped along American shores, before cities were built in secret and code breakers worked through the night, there was 1939, and almost no one in the United States believed the coming war would reach them. September 1, 1939. At dawn, German forces crossed into Poland. Tanks rolled forward under a strategy the world had not yet fully understood. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed, coordination, shock. Within days, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt advanced a nation determined to stay out of it. The memory of World War I was still raw. More than 100,000 American dead. Many believed that conflict had been a mistake, a European disaster that dragged the United States into bloodshed for unclear gains. The dominant mood in 1939 was caution. Polls showed overwhelming opposition to entering another European war. The Atlantic Ocean felt wide enough. The illusion of distance. In 1939, the U.S. military was not prepared for global war. The Army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. Much of its equipment dated back to World War I. The Navy was stronger, but still expanding under recent authorization bills. American industry was recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment remained high. The focus was domestic stability, not overseas intervention. Yet Roosevelt understood something many Americans did not. Technology had shrunk the world. Aircraft extended reach, submarines could cross oceans, radio connected continents instantly. The war in Europe might not stay in Europe. Cash and carry. Congress had passed neutrality acts in the mid-1930s to avoid entanglement in foreign wars. But in 1939, Roosevelt pushed for revisions. Under a cash and carry policy, nations at war could purchase American arms if they paid cash and transported the goods themselves. It was a careful step. Official neutrality, practical support for Britain and France. It signaled a quiet shift. America was not yet fighting, but it was no longer indifferent. The fall of Europe. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. In May, the Wehrmacht stormed through Belgium and the Netherlands, then drove into France with stunning speed. The Maginot Line, believed to be an impregnable defense, was bypassed. By June, Paris fell. France, one of Europe's great powers, collapsed in 6 weeks. The speed stunned American observers. Across the Atlantic, radio broadcasts described refugees fleeing roads clogged with carts and automobiles. Photographs of German troops marching beneath the Arc de Triomphe circulated widely. If France could fall that quickly, what about Britain? The Battle of Britain. In the summer and fall of 1940, Germany turned its air force toward Britain. The Luftwaffe launched sustained bombing campaigns against airfields, radar stations, and eventually cities. London burned under the Blitz, yet Britain held. Royal Air Force pilots, aided by radar systems that tracked incoming formations, managed to repel the invasion threat. For Americans watching from afar, the Battle of Britain became a symbol of resistance. Roosevelt moved further. In September 1940, the United States enacted its first peacetime draft. It was controversial, but the message was clear. Preparation could no longer wait. Destroyers for bases. Britain's survival depended heavily on Atlantic supply lines. German U-boats were already hunting merchant ships aggressively. In September 1940, Roosevelt approved a bold exchange. The United States transferred 50 aging destroyers to Britain. In return, it gained access to British bases in the Caribbean and Atlantic. It was not a declaration of war, but it was alignment. America's coastline defense perimeter effectively shifted eastward. The Atlantic becomes a battleground. Even before official entry into the war, American ships began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic. German submarines tested boundaries. In October 1941, the destroyer USS Reuben James was torpedoed by a German U-boat off Iceland. More than 100 American sailors died. The United States was still technically neutral, but American blood had already been spilled. The other front, the Pacific. While Europe convulsed, Japan expanded across East Asia. It had invaded China years earlier. Now it eyed Southeast Asia's resources. The United States imposed economic sanctions, including an oil embargo. Tensions escalated rapidly. Diplomats met in Washington. Negotiations stalled. Military planners on both sides prepared contingencies. By late 1941, the path toward confrontation was narrowing. The election of 1940. Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940. He promised to keep America out of foreign wars. He also promised readiness. His opponent, Wendell Willkie, criticized aspects of foreign policy, but did not advocate isolation at any cost. The American public sensed danger, but remained divided. Roosevelt won. The margin reflected uncertainty, not enthusiasm. The country stood between memory and fear. A quiet mobilization. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States was mobilizing industrially. Aircraft production accelerated dramatically. Shipyards expanded. Training camps filled with recruits. The Arsenal of Democracy speech delivered by Roosevelt in December 1940 framed the nation as a supplier of weapons to those already fighting tyranny. Factories in Detroit began retooling for military contracts. Unemployment declined. The economy shifted. The transformation had begun before the attack that would define it. Intelligence warnings. Throughout 1941, American intelligence intercepted fragments of Japanese diplomatic communications. Cryptanalysts had broken parts of Japan's diplomatic cipher system. Signals hinted at deteriorating relations, but the exact target of Japanese military planning remained uncertain. On December 7, 1941, that uncertainty ended. Pearl Harbor was attacked. The Pacific Fleet suffered devastating losses. The United States declared war on Japan the next day. Germany declared war on the United States shortly after. The global conflict that began in Poland in 1939 now fully enveloped America. Looking back at 1939. It is easy in hindsight to see inevitability, but in 1939, nothing felt inevitable. The United States could have remained more isolated. Britain might have fallen. France might have held longer. Japan might have chosen a different path. History did not unfold because it had to. It unfolded because of decisions, political, military, economic, made under uncertainty. In 1939, America stood at the edge of involvement without fully realizing it. Within 6 years, it would reshape the global order. But in that first year, it was still watching, still debating, still hoping oceans were enough. They were not. And the story that followed of burning seas, drifting bombs, Arctic patrols, secret cities, and nuclear brinkmanship all traces back to that moment when tanks crossed into Poland and the world tipped forward into modern war. On the morning of September 3, 1939, as Britain declared war on Germany, the United States did something quieter. It listened. Across the country, radios crackled with European broadcasts. Newspapers rushed out special editions. But inside government offices in Washington, something more deliberate was unfolding. America was not entering the war. It was studying it. And in that study lay the foundation for everything that followed. The arsenal begins to stir. In 1939, American factories were not yet churning out tanks or bombers at wartime speed, but planners were already running projections. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would no longer be a buffer. German naval power could expand westward. Submarine bases in France would threaten shipping lanes. Military advisors began quietly updating contingency plans. One of them was Plan Dog, drafted in late 1940 by Admiral Harold Stark. It argued that if war came, defeating Germany must take priority over Japan. The United States had not yet been attacked, yet its leadership was already thinking in global terms. The Atlantic patrols. Even before formal entry into the war, American naval vessels began neutrality patrols in the Atlantic. Officially, they monitored for violations of international law. In practice, they tracked German submarines and relayed intelligence to Britain. It was a delicate dance. American destroyers shadowed U-boats but did not engage. Lines were drawn and quietly blurred. German commanders took note. The Atlantic was becoming less neutral by the month. Industry as strategy. In 1939 and 1940, the true turning point was not military, it was industrial. Roosevelt understood that production capacity would decide the war. The United States began expanding aircraft manufacturing dramatically. In 1939, the country produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1941, production numbers multiplied. Automobile plants experimented with tank components. Shipyards expanded capacity for cargo vessels. The groundwork for what Roosevelt later called the arsenal of democracy was already in motion. When war finally came, the ramp-up would be explosive, but it was not spontaneous. It was prepared. Public opinion shifts. Throughout 1939 and 1940, American opinion was divided. Isolationist groups like the America First Committee argued against involvement in Europe's conflict. Among its prominent voices was Charles Lindbergh, the famed aviator. They believed intervention would drain resources and entangle the nation in endless foreign disputes. Others saw the fall of democracies as a warning. As Nazi victories mounted, sympathy for Britain increased. Still, most Americans did not want war. They wanted safety without sacrifice. History rarely grants that combination. The intelligence revolution begins. Long before Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts were already at work. Under William Friedman's leadership, U.S. code breakers began penetrating Japanese diplomatic codes. These early successes did not prevent the attack in Hawaii, but they proved something crucial. Information could change the course of conflict. Signals intelligence, barely institutionalized in 1939, would become one of the war's most decisive tools. The invisible battlefield was already forming. The hemispheric defense doctrine. Another quiet development of 1939 was strategic redefinition. The United States expanded the concept of hemispheric defense. The Western Hemisphere was declared a zone of strategic interest. Any foreign military presence within it would be treated as a threat. This doctrine justified naval patrols deeper into the Atlantic. It also laid the groundwork for later actions in Greenland and Iceland. The geographic shield was no longer just coastline. It extended outward into ocean corridors. Europe collapses, America watches. When France fell in June 1940, the shock in Washington was profound. If Britain fell next, Germany would dominate Western Europe entirely. Roosevelt accelerated aid through Lend-Lease in 1941, supplying Britain with arms, ammunition, food, and fuel. It was one of the most consequential economic programs in American history. The United States became the industrial backbone of Allied resistance before firing a single official shot. Meanwhile, events in Asia tightened the noose. Japan's expansion into French Indochina alarmed Washington. Economic sanctions followed. Oil exports were restricted. For Japan, dependent on imported fuel, this was existential pressure. Diplomacy continued through 1941, but mistrust deepened. Military planners in Tokyo began developing contingency operations. One of those plans targeted the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In 1939, such an attack would have seemed unimaginable to most Americans. By late 1941, it was underway. The final months before the storm. Throughout 1941, tension thickened. American ships escorted convoys deeper into the Atlantic. German U-boats grew more aggressive. The destroyer USS Greer exchanged fire with a submarine in September. In October, USS Reuben James was sunk. Yet Congress had not declared war. The country hovered in a strange in-between state, armed neutrality. Factories worked overtime. Troops trained. Diplomats negotiated. Everyone sensed movement. Few knew the timing. December 7th, 1941. When Japanese aircraft appeared over Hawaii, the debate ended in minutes. The illusion of distance collapsed. Oceans were no longer barriers. They were highways. Within days, Germany declared war on the United States. The conflict that began in Poland in 1939 had become global in scope and American in participation. But the groundwork for that moment, industrial, strategic, psychological, had been laid over 2 careful, conflicted years. Why 1939 matters. We often treat 1941 as the beginning of America's war, but 1939 was the hinge. It was the year the United States began preparing without fully admitting it. The year neutrality shifted from principle to posture. The year industry pivoted quietly towards arms. The year intelligence efforts intensified. The year oceans began to feel smaller. Without those early decisions, the rapid mobilization after Pearl Harbor would have been impossible. Without the industrial buildup, there would be no Liberty ships flooding the Atlantic. Without early code breaking, there would be no advantage at Midway. Without hemispheric defense planning, Greenland and Atlantic patrols would not have been secured. 1939 was the quiet ignition. No explosions, no burning battleships, just policy shifts, production orders, and a growing awareness that the world was tilting towards something vast and uncontrollable. And when it finally broke open in December 1941, the United States was not ready, but it was not unprepared either, because the transformation had already begun, slowly, reluctantly, and almost invisibly, the moment Europe went to war.
The strangest attack on the continental United States did not come from a submarine. It drifted in on the wind. No engine, no pilot, no warning. And for months, the American government told the public nothing. In the winter of 1944, something unusual began appearing in the skies over the Pacific Northwest. Ranchers in Oregon found scraps of paper and silk tangled in trees. Loggers discovered strange metal rings in the forest. Children stumbled upon wires and sandbags in open fields. At first, it seemed like debris from some distant accident. Then, a bomb went off. The silent weapons from Japan. After the tide of war turned against Japan in 1943, its military leadership searched desperately for a way to strike the American mainland. Direct naval assault was impossible. Long-range bombing missions were unrealistic. But Japanese meteorologists had discovered something remarkable years earlier. High above the Pacific Ocean, at around 30,000 feet, a powerful current of air flows eastward at tremendous speed. Today, we call it the jet stream. In the early 1940s, it was poorly understood in the West. Japanese scientists realized something bold. If they launched hydrogen balloons carrying incendiary bombs into that current, the wind itself could carry them to North America. No pilots required, no submarines needed, just wind. The project was approved. It was called the Fugo Campaign. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched more than 9,000 bomb-carrying balloons toward the United States. Most Americans never heard about it. How the balloons worked. The Fugo balloons were engineering feats built under wartime scarcity. They were about 33 feet in diameter, made from hundreds of sheets of handmade mulberry paper glued together with plant paste. Many were assembled by Japanese schoolgirls working in large halls, unaware of the full mission. Each balloon carried incendiary bombs designed to start forest fires, occasionally anti-personnel bombs, a sophisticated ballast system that automatically released sandbags to maintain altitude during temperature changes, and a self-destruct mechanism to destroy evidence. The idea was simple. If enough balloons made it across the Pacific, they would ignite massive forest fires in the American West, draining resources and causing panic. And some of them made it. The government's silence. In December 1944, American radar began tracking strange objects over the West Coast. Reports trickled in from California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, even as far inland as Michigan. Farmers found balloon wreckage in their fields. Pilots reported sightings. In some cases, small fires erupted in remote forest areas. The U.S. government quickly realized what was happening. But instead of issuing public warnings, officials chose secrecy. The Office of Censorship asked newspapers and radio stations not to report any balloon incidents. The strategy was deliberate. If Japan believed the balloons were failing, they might abandon the program. And it worked. Japanese intelligence had no reliable feedback from North America. When no major fire reports surfaced in U.S. media, commanders assumed the mission had failed. What they did not know was that American news outlets were intentionally silent. For months, strange bombs floated across American skies, and the public remained unaware. The only fatal attack on the U.S. mainland. On May 5, 1945, in the forests near Bly, Oregon, a Sunday school group set out on a picnic. Reverend Archie Mitchell had parked his car along a remote road while his pregnant wife, Elsie, and 5 children walked ahead. The children found something in the woods. It looked like a large balloon tangled in the brush. When Elsie approached to examine it, the device detonated. She and all 5 children were killed instantly. They were the only civilians killed by enemy action on the continental United States during World War II. The news was finally released to the public, partly because the tragedy could not be concealed. But even then, the full scope of the balloon campaign remained classified for years. A weapon that nearly worked. Ironically, the Fugo strategy might have caused catastrophic fires had launched earlier. The winter of 1944 and early 1945 were unusually wet across much of the Pacific Northwest. Forests were damp. Fire spread was limited. Had the balloons arrived during peak summer drought conditions, the outcome could have been different. More than 300 balloons were confirmed to have reached North America. Some traveled over 5,000 miles. One balloon even knocked out power lines supplying electricity to part of the Hanford Engineer Works in Washington state. Hanford was producing plutonium for the Manhattan Project. The outage was brief. Backup systems restored power quickly. But for a moment, a paper balloon built by school children in Japan disrupted a facility that was building the atomic bomb. History turns on fragile threads. Panic that never happened. The Fugo campaign reveals something remarkable about American wartime psychology. There was no mass hysteria, no widespread fear, because most Americans never knew. The Office of Censorship effort stands as one of the most effective information suppression campaigns in U.S. history. Editors cooperated, radio broadcasters complied, local authorities quietly disposed of balloon remnants. Japanese military planners eventually terminated the project in April 1945, convinced it had failed. They never realized how close some devices came to critical infrastructure. They never knew about Bly, Oregon. A pattern of overlooked attacks. By 1945, a quiet pattern had emerged. Submarines sinking ships off New York, saboteurs landing on Long Island, balloon bombs drifting into Montana, oil fields shelled in California, espionage networks uncovered in major cities. World War II did not remain overseas. It brushed American soil repeatedly. And yet the dominant national memory focuses on distant battlefields, Normandy, Iwo Jima, Midway. The mainland attacks feel almost fictional, but they happened. And there was another moment during the war when Americans believed enemy aircraft were flying over Los Angeles. The sky lit up, anti-aircraft guns fired for hours, thousands of shells exploded over the city. Nothing was hit. No wreckage was found. To this day, historians debate what really happened. It was February 1942, and for one surreal night, America believed it was under aerial invasion.
If you want to understand 1939 fully, you have to step even further back. Because the war that exploded in September did not begin that morning. It had been assembling itself for years, and much of the world saw it coming. The long shadow of the First World War. When World War I ended in 1918, Europe was exhausted. Empires collapsed, borders shifted, economies shattered. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe penalties on Germany, territorial losses, military restrictions, and crushing reparations. Many Americans supported the treaty in principle, but rejected deeper political entanglement. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Instead, it turned inward. The 1920s brought economic growth. The 1930s brought collapse. The Great Depression destabilized governments across the globe. In Germany, economic desperation and political chaos opened the door for extremism. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, democratic institutions were dismantled. Political opponents were jailed. Rearmament began quietly, then openly. Warnings ignored. Throughout the mid-1930s, Germany violated treaty restrictions. It rebuilt its military. It remilitarized the Rhineland. It annexed Austria in 1938. Then came Czechoslovakia. At the Munich Conference in 1938, Britain and France agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland, hoping concession would preserve peace. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned declaring peace for our time. Within months, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The pattern was clear. Appeasement had failed. But still, many in the United States hoped distance would protect them. America between wars. During the 1930s, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts to prevent the financial and military entanglements that had preceded U.S. involvement in World War I. Isolationism was not fringe, it was mainstream. The country struggled through economic depression. Breadlines and unemployment dominated headlines. Foreign war felt like someone else's burden. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched Europe carefully. He understood that technological advances, aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, submarines, made oceans less absolute as defenses. He also understood something subtler. If Britain fell, American security would be directly threatened. The pact that shocked the world. On August 23, 1939, just days before Germany invaded Poland, an announcement stunned global leaders. Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The agreement, formerly known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Two ideological enemies, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, had agreed not to fight each other. For Hitler, it meant he could invade Poland without immediate fear of Soviet opposition. For Stalin, it bought time. For the world, it removed the final barrier to war. The invasion of Poland. At dawn on September 1st, German forces launched a coordinated assault by land and air. The Luftwaffe bombed cities and infrastructure. Armored divisions advanced rapidly, encircling Polish forces. The term blitzkrieg entered global vocabulary. 17 days later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, honoring the secret terms of the pact. Poland was partitioned. Within weeks, it ceased to exist as an independent state. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but they could not save Poland. The conflict had begun with brutal clarity. America's calculated distance. In Washington, Roosevelt declared neutrality, but neutrality did not mean passivity. Military planners accelerated readiness measures. Congress amended neutrality laws to allow arms sales to Allied powers under cash and carry provisions. Publicly, the United States avoided commitment. Privately, it leaned toward Britain and France. The nation stood on a narrow bridge between caution and inevitability. The quiet rearmament. One of the most astonishing aspects of 1939 was how quietly the American war machine began assembling itself. Aircraft contracts multiplied, shipbuilding programs expanded, research into radar and communications intensified. The U.S. Army Air Corps invested in long-range bomber development. Industrial capacity was still limited compared to what it would become, but the blueprint for mass mobilization was forming. Factories that once built refrigerators and automobiles would soon produce tanks and bombers. The transformation required planning. 1939 was the planning year. The human factor. It's easy to describe war in terms of nations, but 1939 was lived by individuals. Polish civilians fleeing east on clogged roads. British families preparing blackout curtains. German soldiers convinced they were restoring national pride. American families listening to radio updates with unease, but relief that the fighting felt far away. Most people did not know how long the conflict would last. Few imagined 6 years of global devastation. Fewer still foresaw atomic weapons. History rarely announces its scale at the outset. The fragile year. What makes 1939 extraordinary is not just that war began, it's how fragile everything felt. If Britain and France had mounted a stronger early response, might the war have shortened? If the Soviet Union had resisted alliance with Germany, would Poland have held longer? If American public opinion had shifted faster, could earlier intervention have altered timelines? These questions have no definitive answers, but they highlight something essential. War was not a single explosion. It was a chain reaction of decisions, each choice narrowing alternatives. The stage is set. By the end of 1939, Poland was divided. Britain and France were at war. Germany was emboldened. The Soviet Union had expanded westward. The United States was rearming quietly. The world had tipped, but the full weight of that tilt was not yet felt. The mass bombings of London had not yet begun. The fall of France had not yet shocked observers. Pearl Harbor was still 2 years away. The Manhattan Project was still an idea in a physicist's mind, but the foundation for all of it was in place. 1939 was the ignition point, the year hope gave way to inevitability, the year distance began to shrink, and the year the United States, though not yet fighting, began to change in ways that would define the next half-century.
The year 1940 did not begin with explosions. It began with waiting. On the Western Front, British and French forces faced German troops across fortified lines. Newspapers called it the phony war. Soldiers called it boredom wrapped in dread. Nothing major happened for months, but the silence was deceptive. The storm was assembling again. The fall of France. In May 1940, Germany struck. Rather than repeating the trench warfare of World War I, German forces pushed through the Ardennes forest, terrain the Allies believed impassable for large armored units. It was a calculated gamble. It worked. Panzer divisions cut through French defenses, split Allied forces, and raced toward the English Channel. Within weeks, France collapsed. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. By June 22, France signed an armistice. For Americans watching from across the Atlantic, the shock was profound. France had been one of the strongest military powers in Europe. It had fallen in 6 weeks. Dunkirk. Before France surrendered, one of the most dramatic evacuations in modern military history unfolded along the northern coast. Trapped near the town of Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of British and Allied troops faced annihilation or capture. From May 26th to June 4th, 1940, a vast rescue effort unfolded. Naval vessels, merchant ships, and civilian boats crossing the English Channel under constant threat of German air attack. Over 300,000 soldiers were evacuated. They left behind heavy equipment, artillery, vehicles, but they lived. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed Parliament with measured realism. He called it a miracle of deliverance, but warned that wars are not won by evacuations. The United States listened closely, because if Britain fell, America would stand alone against a hostile Europe. The Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, Germany launched an air campaign designed to break Britain's defenses and morale. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields, radar stations, and later cities. This was the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, held firm. Radar technology and coordinated air defense networks gave Britain a critical edge. For months, civilians endured nightly bombing raids. London burned, homes collapsed, families sheltered underground. Yet Britain did not surrender. The Battle of Britain marked the first significant defeat of Hitler's military machine. For American observers, it proved something vital. Germany was not invincible. America moves closer. By 1940, neutrality felt increasingly theoretical. President Franklin Roosevelt faced a divided nation. Many Americans supported Britain morally. Fewer supported entering the war. Still, Roosevelt understood the stakes. In September 1940, the United States enacted the first peacetime draft in its history. The Selective Training and Service Act required men aged 21 to 35 to register. This was extraordinary. America was not officially at war, yet it was preparing for one. Destroyers for bases. In one of the most creative diplomatic maneuvers of the era, the United States transferred 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for access to British military bases in the Western Hemisphere. No direct war declaration, no formal alliance, but a clear signal. The Atlantic Ocean was becoming a shared defensive zone. Isolation was dissolving, piece by piece. The arsenal begins to form. American factories were still producing consumer goods, but production lines were shifting. Automobile plants studied how to convert to tank manufacturing. Aircraft production accelerated. Shipyards expanded capacity. In 1939, the U.S. military ranked modestly among world powers. By late 1940, it was scaling rapidly. The United States was becoming what Roosevelt would later call the arsenal of democracy. The phrase was not yet famous, but the machinery behind it was taking shape. Political tensions at home. Not everyone supported this shift. The America First Committee argued against intervention. They believed entering the war would drain resources and cost American lives unnecessarily. Prominent voices insisted that oceans remained protective barriers. Others warned that dictators rarely stop voluntarily. Debates filled newspapers and radio broadcasts. Families argued across dinner tables. The country was wrestling with its identity. Was America a fortress, or was it already part of a global system that could not be ignored? A world on edge. By the end of 1940, France was occupied. Britain stood alone in Western Europe. Germany controlled vast territory. The Soviet Union remained officially neutral. The United States was rearming, drafting soldiers, and supplying Britain. But war had not yet reached American soil. That distance created a dangerous illusion, because beyond Europe, another power was expanding aggressively. In Asia, the empire of Japan was moving deeper into China and Southeast Asia. Tensions with the United States were growing. Oil, trade, and naval positioning would soon collide. The Pacific was becoming as volatile as the Atlantic. The pisological shift. If 1939 was ignition, 1940 was realization. Americans began to sense that the world order was collapsing. Democracy in Europe was shrinking. Authoritarian regimes were expanding. And technology had changed the speed and scale of warfare. Airplanes crossed oceans, submarines stalked shipping lanes, radio carried speeches instantly across continents. Distance was no longer safety. Still, the majority of Americans hoped war could be avoided. Hope is powerful, but history often moves regardless of it. As 1941 approached, the United States stood on a narrowing path. It was supplying one side, training soldiers, building ships, preparing defenses, but it had not yet fired a shot. That would change, and when it did, the transformation of America, economically, militarily, and culturally, would be total. If you'd like, I'll continue into 1941, the Lend-Lease Act, escalating Atlantic confrontations, Japan's expansion, and the attack that ended American neutrality forever.
In the summer of 1942, the United States began building a city that did not officially exist. It had no name on most maps. Its residents used post office boxes instead of street addresses. And if you asked what people did there, the answer was always the same: construction. It was a lie. The letter that changed everything. 3 years earlier, in August 1939, a physicist with wild hair and a thick accent signed a letter that would alter history. Albert Einstein warned President Franklin Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might be attempting to build a new kind of bomb, one based on nuclear fission. The science was recent. In 1938, German chemists had split the uranium atom. The implications were staggering. If a chain reaction could be controlled or uncontrolled, it could release energy beyond anything the world had seen. Roosevelt did not immediately launch a crash program, but after Pearl Harbor, Hesitation vanished. The project was given an ordinary name to conceal its scale: the Manhattan Engineer District. History would call it the Manhattan Project. Cities built in secret. The atomic bomb was not built in one place. It required an industrial network unlike anything before it. 3 primary sites emerged: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to enrich uranium; Hanford, Washington, to produce plutonium; and Los Alamos, New Mexico, to design and assemble the weapon. Each location was chosen for isolation, access to water and power, and distance from major population centers. Oak Ridge grew from farmland into a fenced city of 75,000 people in less than 2 years. Hanford consumed vast stretches of desert along the Columbia River. Los Alamos rose atop a remote mesa in New Mexico, accessible by a single guarded road. None appeared on ordinary maps. Mail was addressed simply to P.O. box numbers. Residents were told not to ask questions. The Brain Trust. To lead the scientific effort, the engineering army selected a 38-year-old theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. Brilliant, intense, and deeply complex, Oppenheimer gathered an unprecedented concentration of scientific talent. Refugees from Nazi Europe, American prodigies, chemists, engineers, mathematicians. Among them were figures like Enrico Fermi, who had already built the world's first controlled nuclear reactor beneath the stands of a football stadium at the University of Chicago in 1942. That reactor, Chicago Pile 1, proved a chain reaction could be sustained. Now the goal was different: build a weapon before Germany did. Racing a phantom. A strange tension defined the Manhattan Project. Its urgency depended on the fear that Nazi Germany was pursuing the same weapon, yet Allied intelligence had limited visibility into Germany's atomic progress. Scientists worked under the assumption that time was short. Factories ran day and night enriching uranium through complex methods: electromagnetic separation, gaseous diffusion, thermal diffusion. At Hanford, massive reactors produced plutonium in quantities never before achieved. Entire communities operated in compartmentalized secrecy. Workers at Oak Ridge turned dials and monitored gauges without knowing what they were producing. Many believed they were helping develop a new fuel. They were enriching uranium-235. The moral weight. As 1944 turned to 1945, it became clear that Germany's atomic program had stalled. The Allied Alsos mission confirmed that German scientists were far from building a bomb. But by then, the Manhattan Project was too far advanced to stop. Japan remained in the war. American casualties in the Pacific were staggering. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, projected potentially hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. President Harry Truman, who assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was briefed on the atomic bomb shortly after taking office. He faced a decision unprecedented in human history. Trinity. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert near Alamogordo, the first atomic bomb was detonated. The code name was Trinity. Observers wore welding goggles and lay prone miles away. When the device exploded, the desert lit brighter than sunrise. A fireball rose into the sky, forming the first mushroom cloud. The shockwave knocked observers backwards. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb worked. The question was no longer whether it could be built. The question was whether it would be used. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th, the uranium bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki. The destruction was immediate and unprecedented. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more would succumb to burns and radiation sickness in the months and years that followed. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. World War II was over. The secret that could not stay secret. The Manhattan Project employed more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion at the time. Yet most Americans had never heard of it until the bombings were announced. Even Vice President Truman had known nothing of it before becoming president. The secrecy had been nearly absolute. But there was one breach. Within the project itself, Soviet intelligence had successfully planted spies. Figures like Klaus Fuchs transmitted critical atomic information to Moscow. By 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. The atomic age had begun, and it would not be monopolized. A war that reshaped the world. Looking back across the hidden chapters, submarines hunted ships off American shores. Balloon bombs floated across the Pacific. Anti-aircraft shells burst over Los Angeles. German weather teams operated in Arctic silence. Cryptanalysts broke codes in guarded offices. Scientists built a weapon that altered civilization. World War II was not only fought in Normandy in the Pacific Islands. It unfolded in forests, deserts, laboratories, and living rooms. It tested not just armies, but institutions. It transformed the United States from a reluctant power into a global superpower. And it introduced humanity to the possibility of self-annihilation. The quiet aftermath. When soldiers returned home, victory parades filled cities, but many of the most consequential contributors marched unseen. The code breakers, the Arctic patrolmen, the engineers at Oak Ridge, the radar operators scanning uncertain skies. Their work remained classified, forgotten, or misunderstood for decades. Yet without them, the outcome might have been different. History remembers explosions. It forgets preparation. It celebrates generals. It overlooks analysts. But wars are rarely won by force alone. They are won by adaptation, by learning quickly, by organizing at scale, by turning fear into momentum. And perhaps the most astonishing truth of all is this. In 1941, America was unprepared, surprised, and vulnerable. By 1945, it had mastered global logistics, cracked enemy codes, built cities in secret, and unleashed the most powerful weapon ever created. 4 years. That is how long it took to transform. Not because it was inevitable, but because ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances rose to meet a crisis no one had fully imagined. And the world has lived in the shadow of those 4 years.
When the war ended, Americans flooded into the streets. Confetti rained down over Times Square. Factory whistles screamed. Church bells rang from coast to coast. The photographs are familiar. Sailors kissing strangers, crowds climbing lampposts, newspapers announcing victory in bold black ink. It looked like closure. It wasn't. Because while the shooting had stopped, something far more permanent had begun. The United States had stepped into a world it could not step back from. And in quiet offices across Washington, planners were already preparing for a new kind of war. The blueprint for a different conflict. In 1945, the United States possessed the world's most powerful navy,
an unmatched industrial base, overseas military installations stretching from Greenland to the Pacific, a monopoly on atomic weapons. But power creates anxiety as quickly as it creates security. Within months of Japan's surrender, tensions with the Soviet Union deepened. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany fractured under ideological distrust. The same intelligence networks that cracked German codes began redirecting attention east. Signals intercept stations expanded. Radar networks grew. Permanent defense agencies took shape. What had been temporary wartime infrastructure became institutional. In 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act, reshaping the American defense establishment and creating a new intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. 2 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The monopoly was gone. The shadow of Trinity now stretched across both hemispheres. The Arctic again. Remember Greenland. Remember the weather stations and frozen patrols. Those remote Arctic outposts did not disappear after 1945. They expanded. As tensions with Moscow intensified, the Arctic became a strategic corridor between North America and the Soviet Union. Early warning radar lines were built across Canada and Greenland. One of the most ambitious projects, the Distant Early Warning Line, stretched thousands of miles across the polar frontier. The geography that once hosted secret German weather stations now hosted American missile detection systems. The war had ended. The vigilance had not. The atomic cities remain. Oak Ridge did not dissolve back into farmland. Hanford did not return to desert quiet. Los Alamos did not close its gates. Instead, they evolved. Scientists who once raced Nazi Germany now calculated hydrogen bomb yields. In 1952, the United States detonated the first thermonuclear device. Its power dwarfed the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oppenheimer, once celebrated as the architect of victory, became increasingly troubled by what atomic escalation meant. His security clearance was revoked in 1954 after contentious hearings that reflected Cold War paranoia as much as scientific debate. The man who helped build the bomb found himself marginalized by the system he helped create. History has a way of turning heroes into liabilities when politics shift.
The Codebreaker's Legacy. At Arlington Hall and other facilities, wartime code-breaking matured into a permanent apparatus. In 1952, the National Security Agency was formally established. Its mission extended beyond decoding enemy military messages. It would monitor global communications at scale. The foundation laid during World War II became the blueprint for modern digital surveillance. The cryptologic revolution that began with pencil and paper would eventually operate through satellites and supercomputers. But its origin was wartime urgency, and its secrecy persisted. For years, even the agency's name was rarely spoken publicly. The psychological shift. Perhaps the most profound change after 1945 was not military or technological. It was psychological. Before World War II, the United States had largely viewed itself as geographically insulated. 2 oceans served as buffers. Foreign wars were distant affairs. After submarine attacks off New Jersey, balloon bombs in Oregon, and radar scares in Los Angeles, that illusion evaporated. The American mainland was reachable. That realization reshaped policy for generations. Containment strategies, forward deployment, overseas alliances like NATO, permanent global presence. The nation would never again assume distance equaled safety. The unseen contributors.
As decades passed, many of the war's hidden participants aged quietly. Former code breakers attended reunions only after declassification allowed them to speak. Greenland Patrol veterans told stories few had heard. Workers from Oak Ridge discovered, sometimes late in life, the true scale of what they had built. Some felt pride. Others wrestled with moral weight. Many simply moved on. History books often compress war into campaigns and treaties. They rarely linger on the clerks who tracked submarine coordinates, the meteorologists who predicted invasion windows, the technicians who maintained radar in freezing winds, the schoolgirls in Japan who glued paper into bomb-carrying balloons without understanding where they would drift. War is a web of ordinary lives pulled into extraordinary systems. What could have been? There are haunting counterfactuals threaded through these years. If East Coast cities had enforced blackouts sooner, fewer ships might have burned. If Japanese balloon bombs had arrived during a dry summer, forests might have ignited at scale. If radar operators over Los Angeles had hesitated longer, perhaps the sky would have remained quiet. If Germany's atomic program had advanced further, the Manhattan Project might have become a race against a ticking clock. History often feels inevitable in hindsight. It rarely is. It is fragile. It turns on weather forecasts, intercepted messages, nervous saboteurs who change their minds. It turns on people. The 4-year transformation. From December 1941 to August 1945, the United States underwent one of the most rapid transformations in modern history. In less than 4 years, it mobilized over 16 million service members, converted civilian industry into a war machine, built thousands of ships and aircraft, cracked encrypted enemy communications, constructed entire cities in secrecy, developed and deployed atomic weapons. The nation entered the war uncertain and vulnerable. It emerged as a superpower. But power carried responsibility and permanent vigilance. The long shadow. Today, when Americans walk along Atlantic beaches, few imagine U-boats lurking offshore. When hikers explore Oregon forests, few know balloon bombs once drifted overhead. When drivers pass through Los Alamos, the laboratory gates blend into routine. When radar installations dot Arctic landscapes, they appear as relics or research sites. Yet all of it connects. A chain of events sparked by a surprise attack in Hawaii reshaped global order, and the ripple effects continue. Nuclear deterrence, intelligence agencies, global alliances, military-industrial infrastructure. The architecture of modern geopolitics was drafted during those years. The final perspective. The most astonishing truth is not simply that America was attacked at home, or that it built the atomic bomb, or that it cracked enemy codes. It is that a democratic society, messy and divided, managed to coordinate at such scale under pressure. It made mistakes. It overreacted at times. It struggled with fear and prejudice. But it adapted. And adaptation, more than any single battle, determined the outcome. History remembers explosions because they are visible. But the deeper story of World War II, especially on American soil, is one of invisible systems coming alive. Weather data crossing oceans, encrypted signals transformed into intelligence, factories retooled overnight, cities appearing where none existed before, a nation re-engineering itself in real time. That is the astonishing part. Not just that the war was won, but how, and how quickly the world changed because of it.
October 1962, American radar screens began lighting up again. This time, the blips were not weather balloons, they were missiles. And for 13 days,
the world stood closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in history. The transformation that began in 1941 had reached its most dangerous test, the island that changed the equation. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers. Each built alliances, each stockpiled weapons, each expanded intelligence networks born during the war. Then, in 1959, a revolution reshaped the Western Hemisphere. Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government and aligned his island nation increasingly with Moscow. 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a new geopolitical fault line opened. By 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba. The images were unmistakable. Medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., New York, and much of the continental United States. For the first time, nuclear annihilation felt immediate. The President's Dilemma. President John F. Kennedy faced a choice that echoed Truman's decision in 1945, but with the stakes multiplied. Airstrike the missile sites? Invade Cuba? Or impose a naval blockade and demand removal? Military leaders urged decisive force. Some argued delay would only strengthen Soviet defenses. But Kennedy understood escalation could spiral beyond control. American and Soviet nuclear arsenals were no longer theoretical, they were operational. Submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes prowled the Atlantic. Intercontinental ballistic missiles sat fueled and ready. For 13 days in October, back-channel negotiations and public posturing unfolded simultaneously. The U.S. imposed a quarantine around Cuba. Soviet ships approached, then slowed. The world held its breath. The moment we almost lost. On October 27th, later known as Black Saturday, events nearly slipped beyond diplomacy. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. In the Atlantic, American destroyers dropped practice depth charges to signal a Soviet submarine to surface. That submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. The captain believed war might have already begun. He considered launching. Only the refusal of one officer aboard, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented authorization. One man's hesitation may have prevented nuclear exchange. The crisis ended when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island and the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey. No bombs fell, but the lesson was permanent. The infrastructure built during World War II, radar, signals intelligence, atomic research, had matured into a system capable of ending civilization. The space above the battlefield. The Cold War also turned upward. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Suddenly, the battlefield extended into orbit. The same rocket technology that delivered warheads could deliver spacecraft. The United States responded by creating NASA in 1958. The race to the moon was more than scientific ambition. It was a demonstration of technological superiority rooted in wartime research. In 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped on the lunar surface. Behind that achievement stood decades of military research in rocketry, computing, and materials science, much of it accelerated by the pressures of World War II. The war's innovations had escaped Earth's atmosphere. Intelligence without borders. Signals intelligence, born in places like Arlington Hall, evolved into global surveillance networks. Spy satellites replaced some reconnaissance flights. Listening posts circled the globe. The Cold War was quieter than World War II, but its tension was constant. Berlin, Korea, Vietnam. Proxy conflicts replaced world-spanning campaigns, and always, beneath it, nuclear deterrence. The concept was brutally simple: mutually assured destruction. If both sides could guarantee retaliation, neither would launch first. Peace through terror. It was a doctrine unimaginable before Trinity. The moral echo. Oppenheimer once warned that physicists had known sin. By the 1960s, school children practiced duck-and-cover drills under desks. Fallout shelters were stocked. Missile silos dotted rural landscapes. The bomb that ended one war became the foundation of another kind of standoff. And yet, the same nation that built atomic weapons also expanded civil rights, rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, and fostered unprecedented economic growth. History refuses to be singular. Power can destroy. It can also stabilize. The pattern continues. Look back at the chain. Submarines off American shores shattered illusions of distance. Balloon bombs proved even paper and wind could cross oceans. Radar misfires revealed fear's volatility. Arctic weather stations shaped invasion timing. Codebreakers turned information to advantage. The Manhattan Project unlocked atomic force. Each step layered capability. Each capability persisted beyond the war that created it. By the time missiles appeared in Cuba, the architecture was complete. Detection systems, intelligence pipelines, rapid industrial response, nuclear deterrence. The United States that entered World War.
The strangest attack on the continental United States did not come from a submarine. It drifted in on the wind. No engine, no pilot, no warning. And for months, the American government told the public nothing. In the winter of 1944, something unusual began appearing in the skies over the Pacific Northwest. Ranchers in Oregon found scraps of paper and silk tangled in trees. Loggers discovered strange metal rings in the forest. Children stumbled upon wires and sandbags in open fields. At first, it seemed like debris from some distant accident. Then, a bomb went off. The silent weapons from Japan. After the tide of war turned against Japan in 1943, its military leadership searched desperately for a way to strike the American mainland. Direct naval assault was impossible. Long-range bombing missions were unrealistic. But Japanese meteorologists had discovered something remarkable years earlier. High above the Pacific Ocean, at around 30,000 feet, a powerful current of air flows eastward at tremendous speed. Today, we call it the jet stream. In the early 1940s, it was poorly understood in the West. Japanese scientists realized something bold. If they launched hydrogen balloons carrying incendiary bombs into that current, the wind itself could carry them to North America. No pilots required, no submarines needed, just wind. The project was approved. It was called the Fugo Campaign. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched more than 9,000 bomb-carrying balloons toward the United States. Most Americans never heard about it. How the balloons worked. The Fugo balloons were engineering feats built under wartime scarcity. They were about 33 feet in diameter, made from hundreds of sheets of handmade mulberry paper glued together with plant paste. Many were assembled by Japanese schoolgirls working in large halls, unaware of the full mission. Each balloon carried incendiary bombs designed to start forest fires, occasionally anti-personnel bombs, a sophisticated ballast system that automatically released sandbags to maintain altitude during temperature changes, and a self-destruct mechanism to destroy evidence. The idea was simple. If enough balloons made it across the Pacific, they would ignite massive forest fires in the American West, draining resources and causing panic. And some of them made it. The government's silence.
In December 1944, American radar began tracking strange objects over the West Coast. Reports trickled in from California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, even as far inland as Michigan. Farmers found balloon wreckage in their fields, pilots reported sightings. In some cases, small fires erupted in remote forest areas. The U.S. government quickly realized what was happening, but instead of issuing public warnings, officials chose secrecy. The Office of Censorship asked newspapers and radio stations not to report any balloon incidents. The strategy was deliberate. If Japan believed the balloons were failing, they might abandon the program. And it worked. Japanese intelligence had no reliable feedback from North America. When no major fire reports surfaced in U.S. media, commanders assumed the mission had failed. What they did not know was that American news outlets were intentionally silent. For months, strange bombs floated across American skies, and the public remained unaware. The only fatal attack on the U.S. mainland. On May 5, 1945, in the forests near Bly, Oregon, a Sunday school group set out on a picnic. Reverend Archie Mitchell had parked his car along a remote road while his pregnant wife, Elsie, and 5 children walked ahead. The children found something in the woods. It looked like a large balloon tangled in the brush. When Elsie approached to examine it, the device detonated. She and all 5 children were killed instantly. They were the only civilians killed by enemy action on the continental United States during World War II. The news was finally released to the public, partly because the tragedy could not be concealed. But even then, the full scope of the balloon campaign remained classified for years. A weapon that nearly worked. Ironically, the Fugo strategy might have caused catastrophic fires had launched earlier. The winter of 1944 and early 1945 were unusually wet across much of the Pacific Northwest. Forests were damp. Fire spread was limited. Had the balloons arrived during peak summer drought conditions, the outcome could have been different. More than 300 balloons were confirmed to have reached North America. Some traveled over 5,000 miles. One balloon even knocked out power lines supplying electricity to part of the Hanford Engineer Works in Washington state. Hanford was producing plutonium for the Manhattan Project. The outage was brief. Backup systems restored power quickly. But for a moment, a paper balloon built by school children in Japan disrupted a facility that was building the atomic bomb. History turns on fragile threads. Panic that never happened. The Fugo campaign reveals something remarkable about American wartime psychology. There was no mass hysteria, no widespread fear, because most Americans never knew. The Office of Censorship effort stands as one of the most effective information suppression campaigns in U.S. history. Editors cooperated, radio broadcasters complied. Local authorities quietly disposed of balloon remnants. Japanese military planners eventually terminated the project in April 1945, convinced it had failed. They never realized how close some devices came to critical infrastructure. They never knew about Bly, Oregon. A pattern of overlooked attacks. By 1945, a quiet pattern had emerged. Submarines sinking ships off New York, saboteurs landing on Long Island, balloon bombs drifting into Montana, oil fields shelled in California, espionage networks uncovered in major cities. World War II did not remain overseas. It brushed American soil repeatedly. And yet the dominant national memory focuses on distant battlefields, Normandy, Iwo Jima, Midway. The mainland attacks feel almost fictional, but they happened. And there was another moment during the war when Americans believed enemy aircraft were flying over Los Angeles. The sky lit up. Anti-aircraft guns fired for hours. Thousands of shells exploded over the city.
Nothing was hit. No wreckage was found. To this day, historians debate what really happened. It was February 1942, and for one surreal night, America believed it was under aerial invasion.